Thank you very much indeed, and first of all, a great thanks to this welcome here in Petersburg. It is for me the second time that I'm here. I was experiencing the weather in Leningrad in '86 when it was already very warm in Moscow, where I studied at the time, and I came only with a jacket, and leaving the train in Leningrad at the time was a very cold welcome. This time it was a very warm one. And I have to confess, it is a great honor and pleasure to be for the first time at a European university. It's really a new experience to me. And what I would like to present today is or can be perceived perhaps as a rather critical reflection upon comparative history. But don't take me wrong, I was trained in the early 80s in an institute department that was very much devoted to comparative history. So all my background is comparative. That is also the reason why we used the first opportunity to create an academic journal in 1990 and called it Comparative. And since I never managed to be at any kind of presentation not being presented as the historian of comparison due to that title, while things have developed a little bit over time. What I would like to do is to go with you through the history of discussions on comparison and alternative methodologies in historiography over the last 20-25 years. And what you will see is that comparative history has been confronted to a couple of challenges and is perhaps located anew in the realm of historical methodology compared to the 70s and 80s. I was a little bit trained in France, and therefore I do it in 3 points, which is the normal way to structure an essay. I would like to focus in the beginning a little bit on the factors influencing historical writing over the past 2 decades. We'll then introduce what the French call transfert culturel. I prefer always the French term because in English as well as in German it doesn't travel very well, because people confuse it always with the transfer of money or with the transfer of technology and see it as a diffusionist concept, while it is exactly the other way around, but I will come back to that. And then I will try to conclude in a way that it might provoke or stimulate further discussion. So, only very briefly, global history is perhaps the fastest growing field within historiography worldwide. We do an electronic journal where people from all over the world submit reviews of recently published books and announce their academic events. And you see from the figures here, going even beyond 1,000 within a couple of years only, that there is an intense publication activity as well as congresses, conferences, workshops, smaller events being possibilities to discuss issues of global history. When you compare to the 1970s, when everyone was convinced that master narratives are now outdated, you are rather surprised by the fact that people are so fascinated by global history, and that almost every week we have a new book which can be called very easily a new master narrative about empires, about environment, about climate, about technology, whatsoever. You will always find new world or global or universal histories of this or that, mathematics, as well as Asian cooking. So, this has a lot to do with the fact that historians came into a very defensive position when social scientists started to talk about globalization. In the early 90s, everyone was convinced that globalization is an absolutely new thing, and therefore historical experience has no longer any value. Yeah, we live a new world, and therefore historians tell us about a world that is passé, But there is no reason to follow historians' talk any longer except for some nostalgic feelings about the past. Of course, historians are clever enough to react to that very fast, and started to claim that social scientists are wrong and globalization exists already forever, or at least for minimum 100, 200, 300 years, and that will give us new business as historians to explain to the world where globalization comes from. New institutions were built when you look into the first association, the World History Association, that was created in 1989 in the US, but then Asia, Europe, as well as Africa and Latin America followed very fastly, and in 2010 we created a wonderful thing that is called NOGVISTO. This is the network of organizations in global and world history. And one of my friends from Australia said the next day, we founded it late at night in a restaurant. And next morning he said he had a dream of small orange animals running around in his room. These are NOGVISTOs, because you have to remember this abbreviation. Anyway, what is more important is that more than 50% of all the American colleges now replaced their good old courses, Introduction to Western Civilization, by courses on world or global history, including now much more of the Asian, Latin American, and African part of the world to their introduction. And as you might know, historical education at colleges is not a very professional and specific education for historians only, but it is a sort of civic introduction to everyone who passes college, so to know about where we come from and where we go to. So in the former times it was from Plato to NATO, and nowadays it is from the Big Bang to today's globalization. So there's an enormous shift in the central narrative, or in the narrative central to American colleges as well as to some European ones. So this is only to give you an idea that books really exist, at least the covers exist, new journals emerged, etc. What were the central debates? One debate about globalization was, is it about increasing connectedness? And is that connectedness leading to a more homogeneous world? That was in the beginning a great talk about the effect of Hollywood, that we are all Americanized, our culture will become flat and will become the same around the world. And of course, people dealt with that assumption a lot. A second is it about flows? So it is about capital flows, is it about migration, is it about commodity chains, is it about fluid ideas, transgressing borders? Or is it not only about flows, but also about the control of these flows? So is then globalization nothing that happens naturally, but globalization then is a political project, or as we would say nowadays, it's a bundle of political projects. Some are run by Americans, some are run by Chinese, some are run by transnational companies, some are run by regional organizations like the European Union. So then globalization is no longer something that happens simply and we are exposed to it, but it is something we participate in as a political project, the one way or the other, by opposing it ourselves to the running project in our country or not. A third question was all about the so-called Great Divergence. The Great Divergence debate targets the assumption that there is a huge difference in development between the so-called developed and the underdeveloped countries, mainly China. And for long, already Max Weber said that the Chinese will never come to modernity, despite the fact that they had wonderful old civilization, as well as the Indians, because they lack the conditions for modern development as Europeans and afterwards Americans do, especially freedom for the development of middle classes and from that onwards democratization, free markets and so on. But unfortunately for all these theorists, Chinese economy started to grow in the 80s. So the question was how to explain that. how to explain the fact that those countries we classified very easily until the 70s as third world, or some of them start to become competitors to the so-called developed world. So this great divergence seems not to be an eternal thing, but something that is historical. So it has a beginning and it has an end. The question was, when did that great divergence start? Was it, as Max Weber assumed, in the Middle Ages, 12th century, when the free towns in Europe emerged and formed the basis for modernity? Or was it only in the early 19th century, as recent scholarship tries to prove? And then it would be a very short thing, you know? Great divergence only from 1820 to 1970. That would be historically rather accidental than a 6 or 8 centuries long backlash towards modernity. And the last central debate, I would say, is what's the role of technology and new media communication? Do we fall into the trap of a sort of techno-determinism, where everything is determined by the use of new technologies? The telegraph first, the internet, and now, and I don't know what will be the next technology, as Manuel Castells, for example, said in The Network Society. This is only a graph. I mean, this is rather invented by David Christian, how globalization went on. He mixes up per capita world trade, migration, and cultural interaction into a graph. I don't know if you can tell me how you calculate cultural interaction for a graph. It's a wonderful exercise. But anyway, it gives us an idea that globalization might be a recent phenomenon, and that it has its ups and downs, or something like that. So, how to deal with these new challenges when using, or when looking at the former landscape of methodologies available to historians. What was prevailing were diffusionist concepts. So a lot of people explained the world simply by looking how one particular innovation traveled around the world. So something like capitalism emerged somewhere and made it then to the other parts of the world. New ideas from the Renaissance times to Enlightenment and later on all the modern ideologies went to the rest of the world and were copied more or less there. The idea was, of course, that some have to catch up with these innovations. That was the main idea of modernization theory. And it was often related to the wonderful story of Western superiority. And all the others had to feel a little bit bad about their lack of innovation and advancement. At the same time, in the beginning of the 90s, area studies made it into history departments. First in the US, and that was very much explicable by the fact that area studies in the US particularly served for purposes of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, no need any longer for any area studies. Until 9/11, of course, then they came back. But what area studies people managed to do was to present themselves now as those knowing about the rest of the world that was not integrated into the former narratives. So if you like to open up your narrative of Western superiority towards something new, including India or Chinese, you need area studies people knowing something about India and China. Same for Africa and so on. And that led first to a new boom in comparative history. In the early 90s, more or less everyone wrote comparative histories. Some of them with more caution and others simply rewriting the old narrative of Western superiority. We have won the Cold War, we have won the final battle in world history, and now the rest has to adapt our system. While at the same time, people became more and more aware that this strange connectedness was not very much regarded in methodology by historians, and that it might undermine the idea of a society that people imagined as a container. Yeah, a container with clear borders where something is in and something develops, but only within this container, without very much interaction with the rest of the story. And that led to new approaches, and I would like to introduce you to what the French call transfer culturel. Again, a couple of books to prove that it exists really. By the way, also some nice people. You see they are already at the age of retirement, so the story has a certain historical root. So the point of departure was very, very small. It was the question, who is Heinrich Heine? Is it a German or a French writer? As you might know, Heine was born in Germany, hated the Germany of his time, a very reactionary one, very much, and lived in Paris and was also there at the end of his life at the Père Lachaise. So he is at the same time part of the German as well as of French culture. And when you generalize this experience, you realize that many, many people, many, many cultural phenomena are not only part of one national culture, but of 2, 3, or even more. Why so? Because they became only nationalized from a post-death perspective, or even during their times they became canonized as heroes of one national culture, often in competing terms. It's our Heine, no, it's our Heine, okay, we will do a bilingual edition of his works. What happened to Heine at the time? It was a French East German team of editors who for the first time brought out a bilingual edition of Heine. And the question was, is there a German part in French history? And the other way around. This was rather shocking at the time because French nationalists were very much convinced that all their French history had French roots back to the 9th century with Charlemagne and going back even to the Romans, etc., etc. All that is, of course, French. And now you realize that many, many Germans traveled into France and made a lot of noise, paperwork, etc. there. Okay, that was acceptable to some French people because inferior Germans traveling to France, integrating into French culture might be okay, but it turned out that it works the other way around as well. So French, even superior French cultural elements are part of German culture. What about these Huguenots living in Germany and being responsible that there is at least a little bit of culture in Prussia up north in Germany? I say that from a Saxon point of view. So all agriculture, all industry is in fact an influence of French, originally French people living there and meshing into this German culture. So, okay. That led then, of course, not only to this funny discovery that there are many, many people moving around and inspiring biculturalism, but it turned into a rather methodological debate. So the question was, what do we do with the traditional idea of a German culture influencing someone else, a French culture influencing someone else, not to speak of civilizing someone else, as it was done in the civilizing mission narratives. The question was, can we learn from cultural theories about appropriation? And you can, when you try to understand this methodological clue, you can compare that with your very individual experiences. Tell something that is very important to you to one of your closest friends. And ask him or her next day what he or she took up. And you will say, unfortunately, this was not what I said or what I believe to have said. unfortunately there is a kind of misperception. But this misunderstanding and misperception is not what happens really, because he or she has perceived your story and integrated it into his own or her own mindset, prepared for a certain understanding of your story by his or her own history. Yeah? Normally I invite my elder colleagues to apply that to the situation with their husbands or wives, and then they look much more inspired to understand now what is wrong at home. But I'm not sure how you will manage this rather bad news. Okay, and from this we have a kind of cycle how we can imagine cultural transfer processes. And instead of one culture A sending to B, we have to understand the cycle by looking into how the society that is holding this new cultural element, how it became interested in that story. Why Heine became so important to French society in the mid-19th century and not someone else. Because he answered, obviously, some questions French society raised itself. But in a new way, in a way that was not yet established in France. So there is a search for foreign cultural elements, and that starts the cycle going on. Then we have to look into the concrete social history of people doing that. So there is someone who printed Heine. There is someone who did a review of Heine's novels. There was someone who invited Heine to a salon and made him popular. There is someone who commented on the new things we learned from Heine in French newspapers mid-19th century. Yeah? So there is a whole social history to be discovered in that story. And then is a second step necessary. Now Heine gets appropriated. He moves from his Germanness into, oh, he's something that is now half French. It becomes integrated into French culture. And the last step then is how these societies deal with the appropriate item. Some do that very openly by saying, yes, we have French elements in our culture. So Petersburg is a wonderful example, presenting some of its architecture as of French inspiration. You can read it in all the museums. No one would say this is originally Russian. Other societies try to hide this foreign origin. Yeah? It is not Heinrich Heine, but it is Heinrich Heine, very Frenchly pronounced, so he became part of the French culture. And they try to hide his German origins. And it's even more so with other elements. French society appropriated in the late 19th century a lot of elements from the German university system. When you go now to France and you ask them, where do you have your seminars from? They immediately say, oh, this has French origins. This is back to the creation of the ENS in the late 18th century. No, they sent a lot of academics to Germany to steal that idea. Why? Because they tried to realize why in 1870-71 they have lost the war, and Alsace-Lorraine. So the point is, they appropriated it, and then they translated it into something that is French. Either highlighted or hidden, you will find a lot of elements. So that was, of course, the story here, the methodological clue. And I will now go through a couple of stations this concept traveled through. It started with French-German examples. As I said, Heine, French universities, and I can go through a couple of items more. In 1993, we started to discover that it works also at the regional level, so that you have not always to look at two nation states and national cultures, but that we have particular regions in Europe, but I'm sure you will find them outside Europe as well, who are more active than other regions to grasp new cultural elements from abroad. Saxony can be presented as some of these regions of highly active cultural transfers, simply for the reason that they had always trouble to live between Prussia and Austria, and that they became a kind of French outpost, losing all times at the side of the French. Yeah? So currently we have this 1813 story where the Battle of Nations in Leipzig, everyone tries to hide that the Saxons lost with Napoleon against the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians. It's a great deal for Leipzig now to become victorious as well and to be against all history, historical truth at the sides of the Allies. Anyway, then, and that is important for our comparative history story, it started with a scandal. 1993, there was a wonderful conference in Berlin held on comparative history, the prospects for the future. Yeah? Organized by two main scholars, Jürgen Kocker and Heinz-Gerhard Haupt, who had already been the most prominent scholars in comparative history, at least for the 19th and 20th century, in West Germany. And Michel Espagne, who was one of the authors of this transfer culturel approach, was at that conference, and he gave a wonderful paper on the limits of comparison. And then these prominent organizers made, in my understanding, a great mistake. They excluded his paper from the final volume of the conference, and it was the only one that was excluded. To make it a coherent volume on the progress comparison will do in the future. What happened was that his paper was published in a rather subversive journal in France, Genèse, and became even more prominent than at page 357 to 377 in this collective volume. So it is how you create dissidence from an, sorry, not arrogant, from this dominant position of feeling. And since we have a landscape that is funny, because in France, no one would care very much about the differences between comparison and transfer culturel. Each and every historian would tell you, yeah, it works rather well, you can combine the two, you have to do that in a rather reflexive way, and everything is fine. While in Germany, careers were stopped when you were in the wrong camp. Yeah? PhD students had to be extremely careful if they say in this or that circumstance that they are going with transfer culturel or with comparison and comparative history. And that made the story a very lively one. Okay, there were some victims, but the methodological debate was much more intense than in France. But at the same time, it was an over-exaggerated confrontation, of course, and we had to wait for the retirement of a generation before we ended with the same conclusion the French do, that you can combine the two things. Okay, I am with the time. Oh God, I have to be faster. So what I would like to say is, when you look at the international landscape, the German model of a harsh confrontation of the two approaches is not very representative. My feeling is that the French can very much live with coexistence of the two approaches. Eastern Europe has a predominance of comparative history, and in between we have this wonderful battles. I will come to the non-European historiographies in a minute. Why this high prestige and long tradition of comparative history? My understanding is that there are two origins in the debate, and we shouldn't confuse them. The one origin in the debate, which is the much more prominent one, is that social scientists in the beginning of the 20th century propagated the idea that comparison is the only way humanities and social sciences can produce plausible knowledge and can convince an audience. While these natural scientists, they started to look for their prestige, would have the experiment to prove the validity of their arguments. Yeah, you can repeat the story by having the same experiment again. As a historian, you can't do. Already Herodot knew that you can't put your feet a second time in the same river, because the river goes down. And I guess this argument has dried out the methodology of comparative history, because it has led comparative history very much into a career as an ally only of social sciences. While there's a second origin which we have to rediscover, that is comparison as a daily life experience, as something that helps us simply to measure all kinds of cultural differences. Distance, yeah, why we are different, Germans and Russians. In historical times, why we are different from our ancestors. And of course, also in daily contact, why we are different. Yeah? So we try to measure all time these differences, and this goes only with a price, and the price is decontextualization to some extent. Yeah? We could never, in discovering our differences between two people or two groups of people, we can never go into all the contexts of these people, but we have to focus on a few factors. And that is what comparative history is about. It has advantages and it has disadvantages. But when we look into this origin in daily life practices, we realize that we do many, many comparisons, and not only this one that follows the patterns of social scientists. And these many comparisons have to be rediscovered after the debate in the 1970s and 80s. That would be my argument. There is another attractivity of comparative history which I wouldn't share, that people try to use comparison to predict the future. Yeah? So when you have some factors and you can put them together in a nice tableau, you can conclude how the items will look like in the line that is not yet filled with data for 2014. Fortunately, every election it proves that this was not true, what people have done in this exercise. Anyway, I will not go into all the details, saying only that Mark Bloch, already in 1928, who is the famous ancestor of all historians of comparative history, had this wonderful idea that there are many comparisons and not only one methodology. And what we should have in mind is that comparison constructs its objects. It is not comparing objects that exist already, naturally, but we construct them in order to compare them. And we should be very much aware of that, because that means that we cut all ties that hinder the current comparative operation. And insofar, there's a strong contradiction and tension to the study of cultural transfers. Cultural transfers put emphasis on the ties, on the connections. Comparison cuts these connections and insists on a kind of status where you can identify 3, 4, 5 items for comparative purposes. And this becomes extremely dangerous when comparative historians create nations. And against what they claim to do, opening up for transnational things, comparative historians are often the strongest people constructing nations and nation states, and therefore they might be a little bit out of out of time, and there's discussions about globalization, connectedness, etc. So I will not go into this. 1994, meeting of global historians with the people of Transfer Culturel for the first time. They simply discovered each other at a meeting, and they said, oh, you are discussing the same we do. Yeah, they had simply ignored so far that there is a development of a methodology and there is an attempt to write new narratives. And for the first time, they realized that it might go together, and that on the one hand, Transfer Culturel might serve a methodology to global history, while global historians criticized heavily people doing Transfer Culturel only at the European level, and said, no, look, you have to include the non-European world as well. If not, this is, at the end of the 20th century, nothing that can be accepted. That led to new contacts of that team developing the Transfer Culturel methodology with people in Canada, Quebec especially, you know, French-speaking part of Canada. It's evident that they met without any English. And they realized that there is a chance to use that concept in non-European contexts. First was here a nevertheless rather Western context, but from Francophone Quebec to Francophone Africa, it was only a very short step, and then David Simo, for example, from Cameroon, jumped in and wrote Transfer Culturel stories from a post-colonial perspective. Then it moved eastwards, and it met with the people in Moscow at the Institute of the Academy of Science in World Literature, and discovered the French-Russian relationship, and discovered, by the way, that all these French-Russian connections had most often a third part, someone who translated it from Russian into German and then to French, or via Scandinavia or via Italy. So this bilateral understanding of cultural transfers was broken, and they became now triangular or even multi-angular transfer processes, which became a more complex story to investigate. And then Ab Imperio started to relate its own interest with Transfer Culturel. I remember, I guess it was in 2007, a first issue came out on comparison and Transfer Culturel. Then it went to America, and that was even harder to overcome, because Americans had developed their own concepts. American historians are extremely good in discovering new fields, empirical fields, and to be descriptive on them. But their methodological level is often rather low. So they had developed an alternative concept that was called simply cultural encounters. And they had no concept at all what happens at a cultural encounter, but they had an interest in all these encounters, so to overcome the diffusionist concept. And what happened then was a cultural encounter concept encountered Transfer Culturel concept. Of course, it was a story that needed, again, some people translating from French into English and the other way around. They had no direct contact. After the Foucaultian fraction in the US, there was not very much interest in French historiography there. It turned back to Germany, but now historians of colonialism, of German colonialism, got interested in that history of cultural transfer. And the question was, have we even integrated elements of our colonial history into our national history? Is racism perhaps something we have brought back from the colonies, and is it part of our national history? And so on and so on. And they proposed a post-colonial approach, called it entangled histories. What you can learn here from all these notions is that historians tend to be very undisciplined. They invent always new terms instead of dealing precisely with a term that exists already. So you have a lot of notions running around and being in the literature, and don't worry, there are often not very many differences between them. The most funny thing is histoire croisee, which came out in 2004 in an article by Michael Werner, who invented earlier on cultural transfer and became now a renegade to his own concept he propagated beforehand. That is rather confusing. The split was simply about money with Michel Espagne. It was a huge a project funded by the German Academic Exchange Service, and they were in competition about that money. And so they had to invent two different terms to make clear to the funding agency that there is a difference. I'm rather critical towards histoire croisée for the simple reason it offers us three things. One is to investigate all this transfer cycle. Fine. Second, it proposes to combine that with a rethinking of space. So don't speak of French culture, because this space is a constructed one, etc., etc. And third, it proposes us to put into question our own positionality. So you neither see transfer culturel nor space, nor do you construct it, but you are constructing yourself in constructing this. All the three things are right, I guess. I would subscribe to all three of them. The only thing is to exercise all three at the same time is, to my experience, rather dangerous for PhD students. I have never seen someone completing a PhD who is doing this. And I compared with dancing at the same time three different dances. Yeah? You will not manage, but you will break your leg. Simply, and then you go to a hospital and it will delay your PhD. Anyway, then we have all the debate about transnational history, which came out in 2004 as well. All of a sudden, people started to talk about transnational history as if it would be something totally new, but in fact, it is related to all these debates I presented so far. And with a look at the time, I will skip that. Perhaps I can come back to that in the discussion what transnational history is. Please ask me later on what is transnational history, and I can come back to these items here. And I will simply conclude with a couple of remarks. So what you see is that transfer culturel is a debate that has its tentacles into various fields and might be encountered under different notions. We could go also into hybridity, cultural hybridity, interculturality. All these approaches have also something to do with it, and it is rather intellectual and institutional competition than methodological clarity that helps us here to understand that. They share a dissatisfaction with traditional historical writing, where the object is understood as a container where interaction is not very much happening. They put all an emphasis on interaction and go even so far to say that interaction is the main driver for historical development. So it's not internal factors within a society, as Marxism, for example, was teaching it, that the tensions between classes and so on, or as modern sociology teaches it, that the separation of various spheres, for example, in a society would move the society forward. But the argument here is that from a certain point in time onwards, interaction with other societies is the driving force for societal development, which is a very strong argument and is a turn in our understanding and has a lot of influences on our curricula, on our narratives, because you can't any longer write a history of one particular society, region, nation, empire, whatsoever, without putting the rest of the world into it, you know. Of course, one of the basic categories of that history is culture. While culture becomes very problematic, of course, when we go out of the box of a nationalized culture, then culture is much more of a search for coherence than a coherent system. And what we see is that there is an empirical interest in everything that crosses borders. So historians become interested in smugglers, all kinds of illegal and legal migrants, in all kinds of transfer of whatsoever across borders. And this empirical interest has nourished much more than any methodological reflection this kind of historiography over the past years. That, in order to save comparative history, turns into a new interest in comparative history. But it's really a new one. So Ken Pomerantz wrote that wonderful book about the Great Divergence in 2000, comparing or asking himself, what do we have to compare with the British Midlands, with Industrial Revolution, when it comes to China? And he argued that southern Spain was as delayed in industrialization as Western China was. So what you have to compare is Yangtze Delta with the Midlands around Birmingham and Liverpool. First global historian who took seriously the argument that we construct in comparison our objects, and that we have to construct them much more carefully than we have done in the past, where it was always talk about Europe and China. But no one has said what he was comparing really in empirical terms. Gareth Austin proposed the term reciprocal comparison. He said, look, we have a tradition of 200 years to compare Africa to Europe in a way that Africa is always in deficit. They are always backward, they are underdeveloped, they are uncivilized. And why? Because we organize the comparison in a way that we ask, what is the equivalent of a wonderful European institution in Africa? And by definition, they have to fail. Why Africans should develop European institutions? If we ask, what is the equivalent of an existing African institution in Europe? Then we have this kind of reciprocal comparison. Then we realize, okay, some of the institutions in Africa might be much more efficient than we thought in the beginning. Never tell it to your custom officer when coming back from Africa that you feel inspired by African ways of dealing with borders. By the way, this is another story. I can tell you afterwards something about that. And what turned out to be the conclusion was the title of the last European Congress in Universal and World History, Global History, in London, 2011, putting comparison and connections together, saying, okay, let's do everything at the same time. And I would simply warn you to believe in these nice slogans, because that looks too easy. But what can we do really is to compare constellations or configurations of transfer culturel. So for example, comparing how Russians and Italians perceived some French absolutism in the 17th century, and how they have done it, and then we will discover it was perhaps the same manuscript that circulated and that was translated wrongly into two languages in order to adapt it to the perceiving context. One. Second, we can investigate how historical actors compared. That is something we ignore very often. Yeah? It is not the privilege of the historian to compare, but all our victims, these lousy people having died already, and therefore we can talk about them in our books. They have compared a lot. And why? Because they were interested in other cultures. They were interested in borrowing something from there. And it is very interesting to see how their interest was led to other places and what they compared with their own culture. Yeah? So hundreds of careers for historians in that field. What you see is comparative history is not over, but has to take the challenge. At the same time, I would argue we go into the direction of a kind of post-disciplinary times, because comparison, as it was described in the beginning of the 20th century, led to the emergence of certain disciplines. Some of them were very much based on comparison, social sciences. Others followed them, historians. Others were victims of these comparisons, ethnography, area studies. Yeah, they dealt with the outsiders of world history. And the question is, if all that's true, what I told you, then some new combinations of disciplines will emerge. So every time has its own disciplines, but I'm not so much convinced that we should simply talk about trans or interdisciplinarity, because we have first to destroy the old disciplines based on a rather rudimentary understanding of comparison in order to see emerge new forms of self-organization in the university. And what you have seen here as well, perhaps from this short presentation, all these concepts do not travel evenly. They are perceived in different contexts in different ways. So the interesting thing is that you can apply the theory of transfer culturel to the theory of transfer culturel itself. And therefore, we will meet in the US or in Russia or in Italy different understandings of a story than perhaps in France or in Canada, while at the same time, these national communities dissolve. What we see is transnational communities of people sharing certain understandings, where you have a transnational community of histoire croisee people, you have a cultural encounters family crossing national borders, and you will find them in China as well as in some US universities. So it's a rather complex world, and I hope, I was too long, sorry for that, but it is such an inspiring topic that I could always talk hours and hours on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, and now, please, questions. Who's ready to ask a question? Boris,
I was thinking about global history. What's about global historiography? I mean, when we can say whether it appears or doesn't appear at all, and how to define it. Of course, there is a kind of intellectual fashion. Some smart people invent something embarrassing, coining some new smart words, and later it's translated into English and published somewhere in California University Press, and it becomes fashionable, right?
Yeah.
But is it global, phenomenon? And also, that's partially it's a pedagogical question. How to train historians in contemporary age when we speak so much and we were obsessed by these global things?
Mm-hmm. Shall I answer directly?
I think so.
Okay. I'm not sure if we share the same understanding of global. To me, global doesn't mean homogeneous, but with an increasing degree of interaction. And what you said reminds me very much of a word by a professor with whom I learned in the 80s, who said, we have a nice idea and write an article about it. Then Germans in West Germany do a conference on it, and the Americans write the book on it. And perhaps that is the fate of non-Americans, having not this sense of of marketing their ideas in the most clever way. But I guess what we see right now is really a speeding up interaction of historians. North Americans, especially historians from the World History Association, penetrated the Chinese market. When you look into the textbooks Chinese students at elitist institutions in China use, they are 80% translated from US textbooks, and especially the Encounter and Traditions book by Bentley and Ziegler has been sold there. So, on the other hand, we see a lot of French ideas circulating as I try to demonstrate it. All the stories about empire and the new emphasis on empire and imperial history is not only Ferguson and Darwin, but it is also very much influenced by Russian historians and by Russianists outside Russia. Yeah, so there is no one who would deal nowadays with empire who would leave out Russia and the type of colonization Russia has done towards the East. While in former times it was very easy to write only about seaborne empires. So that's number one of the interaction, where I use national terms to describe the interaction, while at the same time you see around the committee, the International Committee of Historical Sciences, which had always these national communities as its basis. What's growing now is the number of thematic but transnational scholarly communities. So in former times there was an Argentinian national committee, there was a Russian committee, there was a German committee. They lose more and more weight within the international organization, but the transnational community of urban historians or of the historians of religious systems, etc., win more and more importance. Their number increases, their contribution to the income of the SISH increases, and their weight within the program of SISH increases. So what we have is all these platforms where transnationally ideas circulate. Now I come to your second, so I would say there is global historiography. Unfortunately, the history of historiography is a rather poor domain. It is in the hands of people who write always the history of the most famous historians. Yeah, when you look into George Igger's global historiography, I guess it has some 50 or 80 names, so as if all the world would consist of 80 historians. The Oxford History of Historical Writing, it's 5 volumes, so to be fair, they have much more space. It's a little bit more to it, but only this History of Historical Writing at Oxford University Press has introduced for the 20th century the history of institutions and the history of the study of history. Yeah, that means not only this one Ranke or whomever, Brodel, but what is really in the textbooks, what really the mass of students in history have learned. That is what I would say is history of historiography, and not repeating the 5 ideas you can find in every lexicon on Ranke. And that leads me to your second question. What do we do currently with the next generation of historians? We try, first of all, to make them sensitive to these transnational problems. We send them as much as we can abroad, because it is no longer valid for a career to know only one archival situation. What you have to do with all these wonderful transnational things is to cross archives from different places, because you have to follow the traces of these damned people circulating. Yeah? I will never find all the papers about Heine in Paris or in Weimar, where most of them are stored because he was a national hero in GDR times. But I have to run around and to find their papers everywhere. This is costly. I have to manage several languages. I have to know everywhere a friend who helps me to find accommodation and access to the archive, etc., etc. Therefore, it was one of the claims, transnational history is transnational practice. Yeah? And what we try to do, but again, it is as much as we can because there are limitations when it comes to resources, to time, etc., is to expose our students already to this transnational environment, as you do, I guess. Yeah, having books from all the different, and not only the Anglo-Saxon world in our library, inviting Koreans to talk to us simply in order to realize that Korea exists. Yeah? During all my study times, I was never confronted to Korea. I had never a course on Korean history. I have never met a Korean historian. I have never read a book about Korea. So when you look into one of the 10th most dynamic economies of the world, I would say this is rather a pity and shouldn't happen again. But there are, of course, limits. I can't teach global history in a positivist sense. Yeah, so this poor student, where I put all knowledge about history into his brain, her brain. Women are, of course, better in perceiving that, but you know, that's impossible. So what we have to give them is methodologies, as I try to describe them, to grasp information which is available nowadays much easier than it was 20 years ago via internet, e-journals, e-books, etc. All these wonderful things that disappear when you disconnect from the internet, compared to a traditional wonderful library. We have to train them to take that and to organize it in a way that it makes sense. I stop here. I could again talk about that for a while.
One more question. Julia?
What about environmental history? You mentioned technology
Yeah.
and history. Technology as an important, field which, described as connectedness. And what about environmental historian? What's
Yeah.
your vision of this new emerging field?
It refers to my slide on post-disciplinarity. My students, I guess as everyone in the world, would immediately acknowledge the importance of environment. There's no doubt about that. We live a green age, and everyone says, okay, I have a carbon footprint, but nevertheless, I'm an environmentalist. At the same time, we are not very much trained to understand environmental history, because what we should have an idea of is at least some biology, some geography, some meteorology, etc. But these are, at least in my country, faculties far away from humanities and social sciences. And they interact much more easily with physics, medicine, and so on. And it is a great deal to bring specialists of environment in the traditional natural science sense into history departments as auxiliary disciplines, and to make them understand that environment has a history. That environment is a political issue, and not only a natural given, but I'm preaching here to someone who knows that better than me. The point is, if we are not able to overcome these traditional boundaries within our universities, and your university is less bound by tradition than my university. I mean, we celebrated 600 years 2 years ago, and our professors feel like we separate from these guys for 600 years now, and we will do for the next 600 years. That's the advantage of tradition. That you have no contact with the others at all. Environmental history that would be my second argument, has to be freed from a certain universalistic thinking, as if environment is again something that is universal. When we create partly our environment, then it is depending on societal development and political strategies. And one of the best works by Joachim Radkau and John McNeill look into that by saying there is a different approach to environment in Germany than in the US. You will realize immediately when you have an American student in your home and he is not trained to separate waste in the German way and misbehaves 100%. But there is more than this fun to that. I guess that could be the contribution of environmental history with an emphasis on history, how these different approaches emerged and to what extent they interact nowadays. Another issue, what I see is to connect it to the history of international organizations. So that was for a long time a separated field of international history, very boring, diplomatic historians dealing with delegations go to a place, coming back with a result of negotiations, etc. That these international organizations have developed their own culture and that they exist like societies is something that is rather new. So people in working for NGOs or even for state-driven agencies in environment, meeting 6 months a year at the place of their international organization are no longer nationally bound, but they develop partly a kind of EO culture. And we try to approach that, what's the culture of an international organization? And it's rather difficult to find the sources for that. What we had recently was sources on misbehavior in the canteen. Sexual harassment means different understandings of gender relations within an international organization. Conflicts about career paths and claims that I should be promoted instead of the other. So these documents, unfortunately, exist only for 40 years, and they are blocked for 35 years to historians, data protection. So you have only 5 years to discover that reality, and afterwards these papers are burned. While any state would guard them as in its state archives, yeah? But what you can conclude from these papers is there already an international culture? Is the German who meets for the first time this guy from Ghana really able to overcome all his or her racist assumptions, and so on and so on. So that's interesting, and I would say there is a path that could be explored in the future.
Okay, Alexandra?
I would like to ask you to talk more about the concept of culture and how it changed during time, because transport history, entangled history, histoire, croisee, transnational history, they all use the term culture, in different terms, different
ways,
and what happened about that concept, and it is really very problematic.
It is.
It comes because water cultures, technological cultures, and all other cultures, and we use it, and it works very well, but maybe we talk more about it.
In the beginning, some 20, 25 years ago, the language was presenting culture as a natural thing that simply exists. And often with the qualification of a national culture. So there was no doubt when someone was talking about French culture, everyone understood in the room what it is about. So obviously it is about Montesquieu and Apollinaire and I don't know, Mitterrand even. Transfer culturel in the beginning used that the same way, and it was very often when you look into the texts that cultures interacted. My understanding is that this was a little bit against the logic of that approach, but the authors were prisoners of the language of their time. What we realize now is that people talk more and more about how culture comes out and comes to the fore instead of exists already. People of pre-modern times have no problem with that because there it was already clear that culture doesn't exist in that strong institutionalized sense, that even kings went around and lived at different places and were obviously influenced by the places where they met the resources to develop their culture. So, but we can't deny that in the 19th century, cultures developed their own institutions. Libraries, operas, and all that, and they became the framework for a canon of what should be in and what should not be in. Evidently, over the 20th century, this was on the one hand strengthened and became more fluid at the same time. So, for example, international organizations have built their own libraries and have put different books into these libraries than national libraries do. People traveled around from opera to opera, some of them with these micro-registration apparatuses to collect all the 20 versions of an opera that were played within 1 year of the same opera. So there was a transnational community of audience, while at the same time people celebrated Bayreuth and the Wagner Festspiele as something that is German. Yeah? And how do we react now to these double tendencies? That on the one hand, communities, often national communities, but also regional, religious communities, etc., invest a lot of resources into these strategies to build their canon. And on the other hand, we have this transnational fluidity, sometimes institutionalized, but very often rather really fluid. So a student who travels between 3 or 4 universities and has read and has taken notes from 4 different libraries, he is no longer a victim and a prisoner of these canons, but he has created on his computer his own culture, so to speak, to remain only within the realm of libraries, because that's perhaps the closest to us here. And that leads me to a definition of culture that is different from the previous one. In the previous context, we had culture, and afterwards we have asked how individuals relate to that culture. Now we can turn it into how individuals try to establish coherence and call it culture. And do they group together to do so? So culture is the establishment of coherence by individuals and groups. And these groups can be national, or they can call their project national culture. But this is only one among many. And I would argue that establishing this coherence means at the same time putting emphasis on some elements, that is similar to canon building, and forgetting about others. But what you have forgotten for the time being can be remembered in other contexts. And that makes it so difficult. So you will not build only one culture in your life, but you will build many. It's context related. It is open towards new situations where you say, okay, now it is much more important to remember this and that. All my reading of Marx during my study times in the early 80s was not very much on demand in the early 90s. All of a sudden, with the discussion about globalization, I rediscovered Marx. I was trained to see Marx as the famous mastermind of the working class, creating communist perspectives, etc. And I rediscovered him as one of the major historians of globalization in the mid-19th century. You know, I had never thought about that in 1981. But obviously my work in the history of historiography as well as in the history of globalization made me aware of aspects in this good old Marx texts that I had overlooked or have simply read in different ways. So it's not rehabilitating communism, but it is somehow rehabilitating parts of Marx's writing that became part of my culture. But I experience very much that not very many people share that culture. You know? And I wouldn't say that this is German or this is the culture of historians, but it is my very particular approach to the problem. And I'm not very disturbed by the fact that this strategy puts national culture very far outside the focus. Yeah? I can easily understand and can analyze that ministers of culture have a concern with national culture and a discourse about that. But it's not my main concern. I'm not very much interested in inventing national cultures. I would say it disturbs my project of how the future should look like.
Okay, so questions? Yes, please. Name yourself, if you please.
Sam Hurst in the history department here. A lot of the ideas, historiographic trends that you've discussed, privilege mobility, but of course not all populations and not all ideas are equally mobile.
Yeah.
Can you talk about where you see some of the, perhaps the blind spots, the dark spots, that this current fascination with transnational history, comparative history, etc., is perhaps overlooked? Do we, for example, privilege elites?
Can you speak about your blind spots? No.
You are, I believe, editing journals, and so you must be observing trends as they're changing.
I reacted that way because I'm always surprised when looking into new papers coming in when you talk about my experience as editor, where people again discover mobility, where I haven't seen it beforehand. Yeah. At the same time, I would insist on it is not the dialectics between mobility and immobility, but the dialectics between flow and control that count here. So we have people who are interested in controlling mobility, all kinds of mobility, and to sell a history of immobility as something that is worth to be pursued. So let's speak about folklore, let's speak about historical roots that shouldn't be disrupted, etc., etc. So I see a lot of attempts to develop new ways of controlling flows as the opposite to mobility, and not so much immobility. If that's true for the 11th century, I never believed in the book of Leroy-Ladurie on the histoire on immobile history, but because he was giving in his other books very nice examples of mobility, of cultural mobility, etc. But this is not my concern. I'm talking about the last 150 years or so only. And I wouldn't see very much possibility to be immobile in the absolute sense of the word. Of course, you can observe physical immobility, that people stay at a certain place. But then they are confronted to circulating ideas and concepts. They may hide it to themselves that they were circulating ideas. But I wouldn't go so far that someone can, or let's say it the other way around. What we have seen over the last 150 years is that many attempts to stop the integration into what Geyer and Bright called global condition by controlling borders, by stopping the transfer of money across borders, so a state monopoly on money transfer to the external economy, that all these attempts failed. Even our North Korean friends seem to interact very heavily with the rest of the world via their leadership negotiating, via their negotiations about the interaction of families, and so on and so on. So I guess the argument has a lot in it that from a certain point in history onwards, all societies were forced to enter that condition that forced them to participate in this growing emergence of markets, of circulation of ideas, and also, of course, migration, tourism, all kinds of that. But I would say physical mobility is not the essential argument here. If that point is in the mid-19th century, or a little bit earlier or a little bit later, is a debate, an empirical debate, but it doesn't matter very much for the 20th century, because this point seems to be earlier than 1900 in any case. It's not about blind spots, but again, this is epistemologically really difficult to reflect your own blind spots, at least at the time where you have them. 20 years later, it's easier. So perhaps I can come back.
Okay, probably one more or two questions, and of course I have the right probably to reserve one question for myself. Okay, so one more question from the audience, please. Who would like to ask something? Well, yeah, please.
My name is James. I'm an affiliated researcher here. I'd like to follow on the last two questions. Speaking of culture as something that can apply to basically any group or even an individual in some sense, my question is why we tend to privilege today still the national culture or the national order as that between which the boundary didn't matters, where transfers are going across. You mentioned that no history student today can get by without knowledge of two sort of bodies of archives. But it would seem to me that even two personal archives would constitute two bodies of archives, different cultures in that sense, would constitute a possible site of, a necessary site of cultural transfer. So does the current emphasis perhaps continue to privilege the national unit over perhaps class culture or different forms of culture that would be considered internal to a single culture, in sort of the more high culture sense? If you think that's justified.
How to be brief on that. First, of course, we have the heavy load of tradition. Yeah, I mean, there are many historians who have learned to be national historians, and they earn their money and they do it very simply. And part of the trends towards transnational history is also to me, can be explained as a way how national historians, who are national historians by training, connect to debates on globalization. So in order to jump into the field without moving totally away from their original qualification. The second argument would be that, of course, the national hasn't disappeared. So I wouldn't say that the national is replaced by the transnational or the global, but what we see when comparing late 19th century to our times is that something has changed in the order of spatial references. In around 1900, the nation was very, very central in the sense that all spatial references had a hierarchical relationship with the nation. So the imperial was a not yet national, either at the center or at the periphery in separatist decolonizing movements, etc. The regional was a subnational, the local was local within the nation, and even the international was an international. So what I call the regime of territorializations was absolutely anchored in the nation and national thinking, even at places where no national boundaries were existing, where no nation was yet built or invented. When you look into Africa, all these decolonizing movements had their idea that the next thing they should do is creating nations, except for a few Pan-Africanists. And that has changed rather recently, I would say since the 1970s. The nation hasn't disappeared, but there is no clear hierarchy between the different spatial references. So my prognosis would be that we are on our way towards a new hierarchy, not knowing yet what will be the central anchor of it. If it will be transnational companies, so that it is more important that you work for Hyundai than you are Russian, or will it be anchored around a world society or international society with the UN at its center, as it was prognosed in the 1990s? One may have its doubts again. So we live simply in a situation where this is open, and therefore some people would say we have to we have to overcome the nation. That is what one sound is. I very much repeat it here. But at the same time, there are other people saying, no, the nation is back. But there are strong arguments why the nation shouldn't be dissolved. Two at least. A lot of Wall Street activists all of a sudden asked their nation state to control financial flows. I was totally surprised by their conservatism. Yeah, but everyone said, please, the state should bail out AIG, etc. In Germany, last night's elections, they celebrate Merkel for having put all our money, taxpayers' money, into banks. And we are happy with that to 42.5%. It's amazing. Liberals are voted out, saying bring the state down. And the others are people from labor associations who say the state is, for the time being at least, the only institution that may guarantee fair standards of labor against a globalized labor market where wages and standards of security, etc., will go down. Because no one will control them, and we are not strong enough. That is what they don't say, but what is in fact the point behind that. We are not strong enough to negotiate with the companies and the employers. So there are a couple of arguments which have a very solid social basis that the nation state can't be overcome within the next couple of weeks. Yeah? I don't know who will secure my flight tomorrow morning. if not a national agency controlling airports. So there's a lot of things where we can say, it would be nice to have the state as an element, but it is no longer in that absolutely dominant hierarchical position, and that makes this tensionsome situation we live through.
Sorry to say this, but we are approaching the end.
Yeah, sorry.
That's probably the very last question I would like to ask. Is about methodology and, well, the uneasy relation between comparison and transfer culturel and so on, tangled histories and connectedness. I'm sure that there is a clash between the two. What I mean is, as you know, as you mentioned, by the way, comparison is very old thing, and it's actually a habit of comparing things in the usual way, and even comparison as a method. To be sure, younger, of course, probably, well, beginning with Mark Bloch, then probably 80 years or something like that, from 30s, from something like that, yeah? But even so. And on the other hand, these current, new current things, and even fashion things, which look not like a method or methods, but like ideology, like approaches, standpoints, or something like that. And to my mind, approaches, ideologies, directions, fashions, they cannot overcome a method. They simply exist in different ways, so to say. So for me, it's like a quid pro quo, something strange. And challenges like this famous piece by Michel Spine, not to mention Zimmermann Werner, when they criticize comparative historians for just perpetuating, this way, national units or national history. Well, this is something strange because Mark Bloch, for instance, quite explicitly mentioned that comparative history should not be exclusively about national cases. That's obviously is not the case. Yeah. So my question is, how serious is this clash or diversity or problem? I mean, from methodological point of view, is so this relation between all these quite beautiful approaches and the method of comparison, and what lesson can we learn from this clash or this encounter, so this debate, so to say.
I found it interesting that you distinguish between a method and an approach. I'm not sure if I'm strong enough when it comes to terms and notions to follow that distinction, but if so, then I would formulate in a provocative way the transformation of comparative history from an approach into a method was the death of comparative history. What you know, the difficulty with your question is that in general terms one can only say, let's do immediately a peace summit and bring these two things together, combine them in an intelligent way, and let's live in eternal peace, as Kant would have said. And then I will meet tomorrow afternoon again my colleagues who do comparative history as a practice, And they establish, again, nice tableaus of how democratic societies are. You know, from very democratic down to non-democratic. And I can only say this is obviously a way of seeing the world that is normatively overloaded. Because the term democracy isn't very much proved in that, and you can use it as a political argument, and you can do very dangerous things with that. Yeah, you can stop credits to that country from the World Bank only because someone who was doing with a political interest comparative or comparison has decided that they are in this or that class. So between the very general attractivity of comparison and the concrete practice of what some people do in under the label of comparison, I would make an enormous distinction. And if all would do comparative history at the level of Marc Bloch, I guess all that debate wouldn't have emerged. But unfortunately, he was killed by the Germans in '44, and succeeding generations were less intelligent. And what they have done, and this happened in the 50s, 60s, was organizing a marriage between modernization theory and comparative history. Inventing particular paths, national paths, so the German Sonderweg and whatsoever, and started to train very, very intensively students on the method of comparison. When you, we are currently, the wonderful thing is I reject always the term methods while I have to teach a methods class in our program. And I start always with, I will not teach you any method, but I will teach you the talk about methods, so that you can see how methods were invented and disappeared, etc. The interesting thing to me is how giant this literature is. Yeah? That is devoted to students training you in this and that method. So there is a strong industry. And I would say we have to confront such an industry to come back to the level of Bloch's understanding of comparison. And I hope you took me right. My final slide was, or one of the final slides was really about let's re-win the flexibility of comparison by applying a couple of approaches like reciprocal comparison, etc. And let's remember that we do all-time comparison. I mean, our ancestors already said the mammoth this year is smaller than this of last year. And we do this more or less in the same way every day. And it would be worth to investigate that. But putting it into a textbook, training millions of students across the world in how to do comparison in a proper way and to produce more people who are convinced of the superiority of the one over the other seems not to me very appropriate. Sorry, this was in the end, of course, ideology, but I'm not sure if people saying that they use a method are less ideological. But this is another story on modernization theory. Thank you.